American factories just lost their safety net. Canada, the single largest supplier of aluminum to the United States, is quietly redirecting its metal across the Atlantic to Europe. And the timing could not be worse for Washington. When the Strait of Hormuz went dark and 10% of the world's aluminum shipments vanished overnight, Canadian exports to Europe exploded 50% in a single month. American manufacturers built their entire supply chain on Canadian aluminum. Start with how completely American industry depends on Canadian metal. Canada supplies more aluminum to the United States than any other country on Earth, nearly half of everything American factories import. That aluminum feeds the auto plants, the aerospace manufacturers, the beverage can lines, the construction firms, and the appliance makers that form the backbone of American manufacturing. For decades, that supply was treated as guaranteed. It sat right next door, it was cheap, and it always showed up. American factories never built a backup plan because they never thought they would need one. The reason Canadian aluminum is so hard to replace comes down to a single ingredient: cheap, clean electricity. Aluminum smelting is one of the most electricity-intensive industrial processes on the planet. Turning raw alumina into finished metal requires enormous, continuous amounts of power. Canada runs its smelters on abundant hydroelectric energy, particularly in Quebec, producing some of the lowest cost, lowest carbon aluminum in the world. The United States lacks both the smelting capacity and the cheap electricity to match it. That is why American factories cannot simply switch to domestic metal. The domestic metal does not exist in anywhere near the quantity they need. Then came the shock that exposed everything. A war in the Middle East threatened the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow shipping lane that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a huge share of its industrial commodities. When that strait became unsafe, global shipping seized up. Insurers pulled back, tankers slowed, and cargo that normally moved freely suddenly could not. About 10% of the world's aluminum shipments run through that region, and when they stalled, the entire global market scrambled for alternative supply. Buyers who had relied on Gulf region metal needed a new source immediately, and they turned to Canada. The result was staggering. Canadian aluminum exports to Europe jumped 50.7% in a single month, reaching $2 billion, the highest level since 2022. That is not a gradual shift. That is a flood of metal redirecting across the Atlantic almost overnight. European manufacturers, cut off from their usual supply and desperate for reliable aluminum, found exactly what they needed in Canada. And Canadian producers, who had spent the past year already redirecting shipments to Europe to escape American tariffs, were perfectly positioned to capture that demand. Here is the part that stings for Washington. Canada had already been building these European relationships before the crisis hit. Over the past year, Canadian producers steadily shifted shipments toward Europe, specifically to dodge the American tariff wall. Trump's tariffs on Canadian aluminum were meant to force that metal to stay in North America and rebuild American production. Instead, they pushed Canadian producers to develop European buyers as an alternative market. So when the Gulf crisis erupted and Europe needed emergency supply, the pipeline was already there. The tariffs did not trap Canadian aluminum. They taught it to find new homes. That is the strategic trap American factories now face. Aluminum was one of many products where Canada always had what the world needed, but the world usually bought elsewhere first. Canada was the backup supplier, the Plan B. But Plan B has a habit of getting rewarded exactly when Plan A fails. When the Gulf shipments stopped, Canada stopped being Plan B and became Plan A for European buyers, and it charged a premium to match. The metal that American factories assumed would always be available at the price they wanted was suddenly being fought over by desperate buyers on another continent. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. The broader pattern shows this was not a one-off. The same Middle East disruption sent buyers around the world scrambling for Canadian resources across the board. When the Strait of Hormuz choked off fertilizer shipments, Canadian sulfur exports spiked 37%. When gold markets shifted, Canada sent its first shipments of gold ore and concentrates to China, more than doubling that category in a month. Nuclear fuel exports rose 55%, most of it headed for Europe. Aluminum was simply the most dramatic example of a single truth. When the world's usual supply chains break, the world turns to Canada, and Canada gets to name a higher price. None of these were new products for Canada. Aluminum, sulfur, uranium, gold, Canada always had them. The world was simply blocked on its preferred option and turned to the reliable alternative next door. That is what makes Canada so valuable in a crisis and so dangerous to depend on when you have taken it for granted. American factories spent decades treating Canadian aluminum as an unlimited, always available input. The Gulf crisis revealed that the moment another buyer needs that metal more urgently, it will go to whoever pays the premium. And increasingly, that buyer is in Europe. The financial results of this shift were visible in Canada's trade numbers. The country posted its largest trade surplus in 4 years on record exports of $77 billion, driven substantially by the aluminum surge and the broader commodity premium. Even Canada's trade surplus with the United States hit $11.6 billion, the largest since January 2025, despite the ongoing tariff war. Canada is in a trade fight with Washington and still ended up with a bigger surplus with the very country taxing it, because when the world needs what only a few countries have, tariffs lose to geography every time. The vulnerability for American manufacturers runs deeper than a single month's data. Building new smelting capacity in the United States would take many years and billions of dollars, and it would require solving the electricity problem that makes American aluminum uncompetitive in the first place. There is no fast fix. Every month that Canadian aluminum finds a better price in Europe is a month American factories pay more or go short. And because the European relationships are now established and growing, that redirected metal may not simply snap back to American buyers when the immediate crisis passes. The financial reality behind Canada's producers reinforces the point. Rio Tinto, one of the largest aluminum producers operating in Canada, reported first half profit rising 47% and raised its interim dividend. These are not companies in distress being forced to sell to whoever will buy. They are healthy, profitable producers with the freedom to sell their metal wherever it commands the best price. When Europe pays a premium during a supply crisis, Canadian producers have every incentive to ship across the Atlantic rather than absorb tariffs to serve the American market. The deeper lesson for American factories is about dependency versus diversification. For years, the assumption was that proximity guaranteed supply, that because Canada was next door, its aluminum would always flow south. The tariffs tested that assumption, and the Gulf crisis shattered it. Canada diversified its customers, built European markets, and positioned itself as the world's emergency supplier of choice. American manufacturers, meanwhile, never built the backup plan because they never imagined the primary supplier would have somewhere better to sell. Now the metal is moving. Canadian aluminum exports to Europe surged 50.7% to $2 billion in a single month. And the relationships behind that surge are getting deeper, not weaker. American factories built their supply chains on the assumption that Canadian aluminum would always be there for them. Washington's tariffs pushed that aluminum toward Europe. A global crisis accelerated the shift, and American manufacturers are discovering the hard truth: when your backup supplier finds better customers, and you never made a backup plan of your own, you are the one left exposed.